During the harsh days of the Great Depression, families were forced to get creative, making every penny stretch while somehow managing to serve meals. Today, I'm honoring those parents who poured their heart and soul into providing for their children when times were toughest. What amazed me most while researching wasn't just how these dried foods lasted so long, but how innovative people got with them. The ingenuity of Depression-era cooks will leave you speechless. And wait until you hear about number 17. It's making a surprising comeback in high-end restaurants today. When the Depression hit, dried beans became America's protein savior. Picture this: a mother in rural Oklahoma, stretching a single pound of navy beans across 6 meals for a family of 5. Those humble dried beans were worth their weight in gold when meat became a luxury most couldn't afford. Dried beans were cheap, incredibly filling, and could sit on your pantry shelf for years without spoiling. Bean soup on Monday, refried beans on Tuesday, and bean sandwiches for Wednesday's lunch. Nothing was wasted. The beauty of dried beans was their versatility. Navy beans, kidney beans, black-eyed peas, each bringing its own character to the dinner table. Families would often plant bean gardens, harvesting and drying their own crop for winter. What's fascinating is how beans crossed cultural divides during this time. Italian families made pasta e fagioli. Southern families created bean soups, with ham bones, and Mexican-American households stretched frijoles across countless meals. In the face of hardship, beans united Americans in their struggle to survive. Before the Depression hit, many Americans viewed dried corn as animal feed, not people food. But necessity changed everything. That golden grain that dotted farmlands across America became a lifeline when fresh food was scarce. Dried corn could be ground into cornmeal at home and transformed into dozens of different dishes. Remember those stories about how Grandma would make cornbread that could get the family through 3 or 4 meals? That wasn't fancy cooking, it was survival. One elderly woman from rural Kentucky told me her mother would make water corn bread, just cornmeal, water, and salt. When times were especially lean, they'd fry it in whatever fat they had, even. Saved bacon grease when they hadn't seen actual bacon in months. What made dried corn so valuable was its incredible shelf life. Properly dried and stored, it could last for years. During the darkest days of the Depression, those wrinkled kernels represented hope and sustenance for countless American families who had little else to count on. Now, I know we're focusing on dried foods, but I'd be remiss not to mention salt pork, technically a preserved meat that was crucial to Depression-era cooking. This heavily salted pork fat with streaks of lean meat could last for months without refrigeration. Salt pork was the secret weapon in countless Depression dishes. Just a small piece could flavor an entire pot of beans or vegetables. My friend's grandmother used to say a good piece of salt pork was like having money in the bank. You could make anything taste good with it. What's remarkable about salt pork is how it transformed humble ingredients, those beans we just talked about. Add a chunk of salt pork during cooking, and suddenly you've got a meal that feels satisfying. A pot of garden greens became dinner-worthy with just a bit of this preserved pork. For many families, especially in the South and Appalachia, a slab of salt pork hanging in the kitchen was essential insurance against hunger. Mothers would carefully slice just enough for flavor, making each piece last as long as possible. The image of apple slices drying on strings near kitchen windows is one that many of our grandparents would recognize instantly. Dried apples were like nature's candy during the Great Depression, providing sweetness when sugar was rationed and expensive. Families with apple trees would spend days slicing apples into thin rings, stringing them on clean twine, and hanging them to dry in the sun or near wood stoves. That sweet, tart aroma would fill homes for weeks as the fruit slowly transformed. One 87-year-old gentleman from Virginia told me his most treasured childhood memory was helping his mother turn bushels of apples into dried rings each fall. Those dried apples got us through winter, he said. We'd have them in oatmeal, bake them into pies when we had the ingredients, or just eat them straight as a treat. For children growing up during those lean years, dried apple pieces might be the only sweet they tasted for months. Is it any wonder that generations who lived through those times never took fruit for granted again? If you've never heard of hardtack, You're about to discover one of history's most enduring survival foods. This simple cracker made from flour, water, and salt was the original forever food, long before modern preservatives. Properly made and stored, it could last for decades. Imagine a cracker so hard you might crack a tooth if you bit directly into it. That's hardtack. My neighbor's father described it as eating a piece of wood that happens to be made of flour. Not exactly appetizing, but when you're hungry, those simple ingredients become precious. Families would make large batches of hardtack, punching holes in the dough before baking to ensure it dried completely. To eat them, people would soften hardtack in coffee, milk, or soup, or break it into pieces and fry it with whatever fat was available. What's fascinating about hardtack is that it represents human ingenuity at its most basic, taking the simplest ingredients and creating something that could sustain life through the hardest times. It's a direct connection to our ancestors who knew that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most enduring. Before fruit snacks and commercial dried fruit blends, Depression-era families created their own dried fruit mixes out of necessity. These weren't fancy, sulfite-treated dried fruits we find in stores today, but rather home-dried treasures that preserved summer's bounty for lean winter months. Families with access to fruit trees or berry patches would spend long summer days preparing fruit for drying. Apples, pears, peaches, plums, berries, anything that could be dried was carefully preserved and combined into family-specific mixes. Mrs. Peterson from Washington State told me that dried fruit mix was their most precious winter commodity. Mother would trade our dried fruit mix with neighbors who had other things we needed. A small jar of mixed dried fruits could be exchanged for flour or occasionally eggs. It was like currency. Children would often be given a few pieces of dried fruit as a special treat. Many who grew up during the Depression recall the intense sweetness of dried apples or pears as one of the few luxuries they experienced during those difficult years. When meat was scarce and meals became increasingly simple during the Depression, dried herbs became essential for making bland foods palatable. These weren't store-bought jars, but rather homegrown and home-dried herbs that cost nothing but time and attention. Families would grow whatever herbs thrived in their region: thyme, sage, oregano, mint, harvesting and drying them in bundles, hung from kitchen rafters. These dried herbs became the secret weapon in Depression-era cooking, adding flavor when there was little else. A woman whose grandmother lived through the Depression in rural Virginia told me that her grandmother's herb garden was her pride and joy. Even in her 90s, she insisted on growing and drying her own herbs. She said during the Depression, her dried herbs were what made beans and rice taste different each day of the week, so the family wouldn't get discouraged. What's remarkable about these dried herbs is how they sustained not just bodies, but spirits. A pinch of dried thyme in potato soup or dried mint in hot water might seem trivial, but these small flavor additions helped maintain a sense of normalcy in abnormal times. During the Depression, dried onions became America's universal flavor foundation, a shelf-stable way to start almost any dish with a boost of essential taste. Unlike fresh onions that would eventually sprout or rot, dried onions could last for months or even years when properly prepared and stored. Families would slice onions thin and dry them near stoves, creating an ingredient that would prove invaluable through winter. Mr. Davis from Pennsylvania shared that his grandmother always had a cloth bag of dried onions hanging in her kitchen. She'd crush a handful into almost everything she cooked. When I asked her why, she said, "Because during the hard times, dried onions could make even a pot of plain rice taste like you were cooking something special." Beyond adding flavor, dried onions had practical advantages. They took up less storage space than fresh ones, didn't make eyes water when used, and could be quickly rehydrated. For families who had to carefully manage resources, these practical considerations mattered tremendously. While not a food themselves, dried corn husks played a crucial role in Depression-era cooking and food preservation. These dried outer leaves of corn served multiple essential functions in American kitchens. When corn was harvested, nothing went to waste, especially not the husks. Families would carefully dry these outer leaves until they became papery and pliable when soaked in water. These dried husks then became natural, free food wrappers that extended the usability of other ingredients. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose parents lived through the Depression in New Mexico, explained that dried corn husks were essential in her family's kitchen. My mother would wrap leftover beans, rice, or meat in soaked corn husks, tie them with string made from husks, and steam them the next day. It kept food moist when reheating and made leftovers feel like a new meal. Those simple dried corn husks remind us that sometimes the most valuable kitchen tools cost nothing at all. When every kernel of corn was precious, the idea of throwing away the husks seemed foolish and wasteful. During the Depression, aromatic orange peels were carefully dried and stored as a valuable flavoring and medicinal resource that cost nothing but added tremendous value to daily life. When a family was fortunate enough to have an orange, often a rare treat reserved for Christmas stockings, the peel was never discarded. Instead, it would be carefully removed in strips and hung to dry, becoming a shelf-stable ingredient that could flavor foods for months. Mrs. Rodriguez from California shared that her grandmother had a special jar for dried orange peels. Abuela would add a small piece to beans while cooking, steep them in hot water for a soothing tea when we had colds, and even burn them in the fireplace to freshen the house when company was coming. Those peels were like gold. What makes dried orange? Peel's special is how they brought brightness to plain foods. In times when sugar was rationed and treats were rare, the sweet citrus aroma of orange peel added to oatmeal or simple puddings created a sense of specialness that lifted spirits. During the Depression, even the tiniest bits of meat, trimmings, tough pieces, and leftover bits were carefully dried to preserve their flavor and nutritional value for future meals. Families fortunate enough to have meat occasionally would save every scrap. These small pieces would be cut into the tiniest possible bits, heavily salted, and dried near stoves until they became completely dehydrated and shelf-stable. Mr. Davis from Michigan described his mother's frugality. Mom had a special jar for dried meat scraps. After any meal with meat, which wasn't often, she'd save every bit we didn't eat. She'd dry these pieces and then add a pinch to bean soups. Just that little bit would add so much flavor you'd think there was a whole piece of meat in there. What made dried meat scraps so valuable was their concentrated protein and flavor. Even a tablespoon could transform a pot of bland vegetables into something satisfying. For families struggling to provide adequate protein, these saved scraps made a significant nutritional difference. Potato skins today might become crispy appetizers or trash. During the Depression, those nutrient-rich skins were carefully dried and repurposed as a valuable ingredient that served multiple functions in resourceful kitchens. When potatoes were peeled, though many families would leave skins on whenever possible, the peels would be dried near heat sources and stored for future use. These dried skins became a zero-cost ingredient that added both nutrition and utility to Depression-era cooking. Mrs. Wilson from Idaho explained their waste-nothing approach. Grandmother would dry all potato peels on sheets near the wood stove. The dried peels had 3 uses: thickening soups when ground into powder, adding to bread dough for extra substance, and making a medicinal tea that she swore reduced fevers. Nothing from a potato ever went to waste. Modern science confirms the wisdom of saving potato skins. They contain significant fiber, potassium, and vitamin C, nutrients often lacking in restricted Depression diets. By drying and repurposing these skins, families were instinctively preserving valuable nutrition. During the Depression, bread that had gone stale or dry was never wasted, but instead transformed into a shelf-stable ingredient with multiple culinary uses. Families would deliberately dry leftover bread completely, either by leaving it exposed to air or placing it near ovens. Once completely dried, this bread would be stored in cloth bags, ready to be repurposed in creative ways that stretched food budgets. Mr. Peterson from Wisconsin recalled his mother's philosophy. Mom would say, "Bread is too sacred to throw away." When it got stale, she'd dry it completely, then store it in flour sacks. That dried bread became breadcrumbs for stretching meatloaf when we had meat, thickener for soups, or the base for a baked pudding when mixed with dried fruit, water, and a little precious sugar. For many families, particularly in urban areas, where growing their own food wasn't possible, bread formed the backbone of daily nutrition. Learning to repurpose it even after it had gone stale was essential knowledge that helped prevent hunger. During the Depression, even eggshells were carefully dried and repurposed rather than discarded. These mineral-rich shells became an important calcium supplement when dairy products were expensive or unavailable. When eggs were used in cooking, and eggs themselves were often a luxury, the shells would be rinsed clean, crushed, and thoroughly dried. These dried shells were then ground into a fine powder using whatever tools were available, often a rolling pin or the bottom of a heavy jar. Mrs. Garcia from New Mexico shared her grandmother's wisdom. Abuela would save every eggshell, dry them on the windowsill, and grind them into almost invisible powder. A tiny pinch went into everyone's daily oatmeal or soup. She told us it put strength in our bones when milk was too expensive to buy regularly. Modern nutrition science confirms the wisdom of this practice. Eggshells are indeed over 90% calcium carbonate, the same compound found in dietary calcium supplements today. By finely grinding the shells and adding small amounts to foods, Depression-era families were instinctively addressing calcium needs. While we think of bran cereals as health foods today, during the Depression, wheat bran was a cheap byproduct that savvy families used to stretch flour and add crucial fiber to restricted diets. When white flour became too expensive, families would purchase wheat bran, the outer layer of the wheat kernel removed during flour milling, and mix it with cheaper flours or cornmeal to create more substantial baked goods. This not only stretched precious flour but added nutritional value. Mrs. Johnson from Oklahoma remembered her mother's bran muffins. Every Sunday, Mom would make bran muffins with molasses. They were dense and dark, not sweet like today's versions, but they filled you up and kept everything moving along. As Mom would say with a wink, we'd eat them for breakfast all week. What makes bran particularly notable is that Depression-era cooks instinctively knew its health benefits long before. Fiber became a nutritional buzzword. By incorporating this inexpensive milling byproduct into their cooking, they were addressing nutritional needs while stretching limited food budgets. The Great Depression was a time of incredible hardship, but it was also a period that demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity. These 25 dried foods represent more than just sustenance. They showcase the ingenuity and waste-nothing approach that helped a generation survive economic catastrophe. What strikes me most about these foods isn't just their practicality, but the wisdom they represent. The complete utilization of food resources, from peels to cores to shells, represents an approach to sustainability that we're only now rediscovering. For those of you watching whose parents or grandparents lived through the Depression, perhaps you recognize some of these foods from family stories. Maybe your grandmother still dried apple slices even in times of plenty, or your grandfather insisted on saving every breadcrumb. If you found this journey through Depression-era dried foods interesting or nostalgic, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of America's food history. I'd love to hear in the comments if your family preserved any of these foods, or if you have stories passed down about other Depression-era foods that helped your ancestors survive.